Hello, and welcome to the AP Biology lectures. My name is Will Tauxe, and for the next 40 hours of lectures, we're going to be exploring the full continuum of the AP Biology course curriculum. We're going to cover all the stuff that you need to know, that you should know, and that you're going to have to know for the test. Okay? We're going to begin with a quick review of chemistry. Now, if you haven't taken chemistry yet, you should stop and go take chemistry, because a lot of the topics that we're going to be discussing in AP Biology are going to be very, very chemistry specific. You're not going to be able to understand any of the pathways, you're not going to be able to understand how any of the molecules are interacting with each other if you don't have a good idea of what's really going on at the molecular and atomic level. Okay? We're going to start off with a quick little review here, but keep in mind, you need to go and learn this stuff yourself. Okay? When we're dealing with chemistry, chemistry is basically all about how atoms form bonds and break apart from each other. And when they form bonds, there's a few ways that they're able to do it. Most of the times when an atom forms a bond, it's going to be one of two forms. Well, three, actually. It's going to be either an ionic bond, which is where one of them transfers an electron to the other one, and then you have a positive and a negative charge that attracts to each other. You're also going to have the opportunity to have a covalent bond, and that's where atoms share electrons without ripping them apart from each other. And it's the shared electrons that cause them to be held together. Covalent bonds tend to be much more sturdy. The last kind is something called a hydrogen bond, which we'll get to in a minute. Go ahead, take a look at this over here, just to frame our understanding of what's going on when a chemical bond is happening. First thing to keep in mind, electronegativity is what determines what sort of bond gets formed between atoms. Electronegativity is basically a measurement of how much an atom desires more electrons. All right? And what you're going to be looking at, think of it as it's an arm wrestling competition. Okay? And electronegativity is kind of saying who's stronger. Okay? If the electronegativity, there's not much disparity, meaning that they're equal, they have the same amount of strength, who's going to win in that arm wrestling competition? Nobody's going to win, because they're both going to have the matched strength. Okay? This forms something called a non-polar covalent bond. That usually happens when you have two atoms that are the same, that are forming a bond. So, for example, oxygen is two oxygen atoms that are stuck together with a nonpolar covalent bond. And as a result, because they're the same, they have the same amount of strength, so nobody gets the electrons pulled more to one side or the other. As you start having an increasing disparity in the electronegativity between atoms, meaning one is more electronegative than the other, what you're going to find is you're going to start producing polar covalent bonds. Now, polar in this sense, think of it the same way that the Earth has a North Pole and a South Pole. It's basically saying that there are ends to it that are separate from each other. Okay? And in a polar covalent bond, what's happening is that the electrons are being shared unequally. So think of it as the electrons are spending more time over with one part than they are at another part. Okay? The classic example of this is the water molecule, H2O. All right? Now, what's happening here is we have a large oxygen that has a very strong electronegativity. And then you've got these small little hydrogens that do not have as much electronegativity as the oxygen does. Now, it forms a covalent bond because the difference in electronegativity is not that great. But what ends up happening is as these electrons are being shared back and forth, so there's one pair of electrons getting shared with this bond, there's another pair of electrons getting shared with this bond, what ends up happening is because the oxygen has a much greater electronegativity, it ends up pulling the electrons to spend more time over at this side. Okay? So viewed between this hydrogen and this oxygen is going to end up being slightly more negative-ish, and then the hydrogen is going to end up being slightly more positive-ish. Okay? Now, this isn't as strong a charge as a negative or a positive as you get from actually taking the electron and putting it over there. Okay? But it is still significant, and it has an effect on how water is able to interact with other molecules. Okay, so this is very, very important to keep in mind on. Okay? Now, if you go all the way over, all right, and on this chart, as we increase the disparity in electronegativity, so we're saying that one of the parties is going to be much stronger than the other atom. Okay? Once you get up to, and it's the 1.4 is the cutoff. You don't need to know this, but it's good to know. When one of the atoms has 1.4 more electronegativity than the other atom, something forms called an ionic bond. Okay? And that's when the disparity in strength is such that the electron can be ripped apart from the one atom and taken over by the other one. Okay? The classic example of this is salt. Okay? Sodium chloride. Okay? What's happening here is chlorine has a much larger electronegativity than sodium does. Okay? Sodium only has 1 electron in its outer shell, and chlorine has 7 electrons in its outer shell. If you remember the octet rule from chemistry, you know that sodium really, it kind of wants to get rid of that 1 electron, and chlorine really wants to get just 1 more electron. Okay? So what ends up happening is when they bump into each other, they form this ionic bond. Really all that's happening is that sodium is losing an electron, so it picks up a positive charge, and chlorine is acquiring an electron, so it gains a negative charge. Okay? Now, what holds them together after that, water is held together by the covalent bond, by these electrons going back and forth, forming an actual physical bond. Okay? In sodium chloride, what's holding them together is their charges. Okay? A positive charge is attracted to a negative charge. So once you stick them together, they tend to stay put. Okay? However, it's not as strong a bond as you see in a covalent setting. Okay? So one thing just to remember over here, okay, is that the strength of the bond gets smaller the further over you go. Okay? So an ionic bond is not as strong as a nonpolar covalent bond. Okay? Just good things to keep in mind. Now, the last kind of bond that can form is something called a hydrogen bond. All right? And that's something that happens when you have 2 polar molecules. Okay? So it's called a hydrogen bond. Sometimes it can form with things other than hydrogen, but the most common form is when you have hydrogen. Here's what happens when you have a hydrogen stuck onto some other atom with a covalent bond. It's usually almost always going to have a positive charge. Because hydrogen is so small, it's the smallest atom, it only has 1 proton, it doesn't really have a whole lot of electronegativity. So as a consequence, usually it's bonding with something else that's larger than it is, so it's going to acquire a positive charge. Okay? Now, this happens a lot in the case of water, okay? Because when you have water, think of it as a negative head with these 2 little positive tails hanging off of it. Okay? So this is the oxygen and these are the hydrogens. Okay? But one side of it ends up being negative, and you can think of it as having a negative side and a positive side. Okay? But there's really 2 positive sides. Okay? And what ends up happening is this: if you have a whole bunch of water molecules that are all together, what you're going to find is that the positive hydrogens are going to be attracted to the negative oxygens. Okay? And it's not going to be very strong, okay? But it's going to be basically the same thing that's happening over here with sodium and chloride. Okay? You have a positive and you have a negative charge, so they're going to be attracted together. Okay? Now, the positive and negative charges on these are not going to be as strong as you find on sodium and chlorine, because that's the transfer of an entire electron, whereas this is just a statistical distribution of electrons, where they're spending slightly more time here than they are here. So it's not going to be as strong of a bond, a hydrogen bond is, but it's still going to be able to cause association. Okay? And it's these hydrogen bondings that water forms that causes a lot of their unique qualities that makes them so vital to life. So let's talk a little bit more about water. You really have to understand water. Water is the sine qua non of life. In order to have life, so far, it's got to have water. Now, we may find something crazy on the moons of Saturn that doesn't need water, it needs methane instead. But for the moment, it's all about water. Okay? Water has some very unique properties that you don't find in a lot of other materials that, when they're all put together in aggregate, make it amazing for the sustaining of life. Okay, so we need to talk really quick about what those qualities of water are. Okay? So, remember what we're talking about over here with the way that the polar electric covalent bonds are forming. Okay? This is a very polar covalent bond. Okay? If we're looking over here at the chart, all right, water is actually it's all the way over the end. It's really close to being an ionic bond. Okay? But it's like one of them is, the oxygen is really close to just ripping those electrons off of the hydrogens, but it doesn't quite. Okay? And as a result, the hydrogen bonds that get formed here are pretty strong. Okay? What that means is water is what's called